Did you or your parents experience the presence of a Nazi war criminal living on your street? Perhaps a feeble old man who was once a ruthless mass murderer in Germany or Poland. Surprisingly, more of you may have lived among these war criminals than you realize. In about 25 minutes, we will present evidence that may change your perspective. In late April 1945, the scent of Adolf Hitler's burning flesh permeated the air, witnessed only by a few individuals present during his impromptu cremation in the Reich Chancellery Garden. Berlin was engulfed in flames, and as the Red Army advanced, dead German soldiers and civilians lay in heaps along their path. The highest-ranking Nazis, including the chief executioners, sadistic scientists, and deranged doctors, were fleeing Germany like rats from a burning house. Some received assistance from the very people they had been fighting against for 6 years. On April 30th, Hitler bid farewell to the approximately 20 individuals in the Führer bunker in Berlin. He had already informed a select group of men about his plan: burn me until there's nothing left of me. Don't let those Soviets take my body as a trophy. Turn me into ashes, Hitler demanded, leaving no remains behind. Despite giving this order, Hitler knew there was still a chance of escape. His trusted pilot, Hans Bauer, had repeatedly urged him to leave the bunker and fly to safety. Bauer had been suggesting this for weeks, even as the Red Army's artillery shells made Hitler flinch. Bauer remained convinced that he could fly the Führer to a secure location. In the weeks leading up to the end, Bauer's Führer squadron had prepared to depart from at least 6 airfields in and around Berlin. They considered various destinations such as the Baltic coast, Greenland, Manchuria, Argentina, Japan, and even assistance from Arab sheiks. Bauer persistently offered a Fiesler Fi 156 Storch light plane waiting at Tiergarten near the Brandenburg Gate. He proposed flying Hitler to Bavaria and from there to a safe haven on the other side of the world. However, Hitler repeatedly refused, unwilling to spend his life as a fugitive like others. Hitler thanked Bauer for his concern and duty to the fatherland, and gifted him a portrait of the Prussian King Frederick the Great. Sometime in the late afternoon on that day, Bauer witnessed Hitler's lifeless body wrapped in a blood-stained rug and taken into the garden. Tears welled up in Bauer's eyes as he recalled how Hitler had fed nuts to squirrels in that very garden just days before. Hitler had been the best man at Bauer's wedding, and now he was treated no better than trash, doused in gasoline. On May 1st, Hitler's loyal propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, and his wife Magda joined him as smoldering masses of flesh and bone in the same garden. Although the Soviets eventually found some of their remains, the hasty cremation had been poorly executed. Soviet leader Joseph Man of Steel Stalin did not desire dead bodies. He sought to capture the top Nazis. Like the USA, the Soviets wanted the scientists, spies, and vast amounts of German intelligence. Among the ruins of Berlin, there were valuable items, but the real prize was the Nazis themselves. Bauer's escape plan was foiled as the road he intended to use as an airstrip was bombed and filled with potholes. Hitler's decision not to flee was validated. The street was crawling with soldiers from the Soviet Third Shock Army who discovered Bauer and shot him in both legs. Not far away, Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Chancellery and one of Hitler's closest associates, met his demise at the hands of Soviet artillery. Confirmation of Bormann's death would take years. For decades, rumors circulated about his whereabouts in South America, Denmark, and Australia, with some suggesting he was a Soviet spy who had reunited with Hitler. The CIA and FBI diligently searched for these two individuals, unbeknownst to the public. It was only in 1998 that Bormann, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, was definitively identified using forensic DNA techniques. Every high-ranking Nazi became part of an intense search for hidden treasures. The Americans were determined not to let the Soviets reach them first. After Soviet doctors amputated one of Bauer's legs in June 1945, he faced repeated interrogations. The Soviets wanted to know, where is the gold? Where's the stolen art? Where are your comrades? Where are the scientists? They believed that Bauer, who had been present at Hitler's demise, knew the whereabouts of the other fleeing Nazis. While newspapers worldwide reported Hitler's death and the anticipated arrival of peace, Stalin remained skeptical. He did not believe for a second that Hitler was dead. Although the Germans did not surrender immediately after Hitler's demise, their cause was hopeless. Germany hoped for favorable conditions, which were not forthcoming. Karl Donitz, the Grand Admiral of the German Navy, replaced Hitler as the head of state and made the final decision to surrender. On May 7th, Alfred Jodl, the Chief of Staff of the German Army, signed the unconditional surrender into effect at the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France. It was a time of mixed emotions. Millions had perished, and soldiers returned home with missing limbs. The Soviets, who had suffered greatly, were in no mood for celebratory events. With 27 million dead and economic chaos, the war had taken a heavy toll on the Soviet Union, despite their propaganda downplaying its severity. Stalin remained unaware of how close the Americans were to conducting the first nuclear bomb test under the Manhattan Project. His dreams of world domination were shattered when his aide whispered the news of the successful American test during the Potsdam Conference, where British and American leaders were present. It became imperative to locate the hidden Germans. Unbeknownst to the public, a secret war of espionage unfolded between the US, UK, and the Soviets. The goal was to capture the Nazis alive, not dead. As you will see, they accomplished this but kept it concealed. Capitalism versus communism fueled a protracted struggle. Hitler was dead, although Stalin doubted it. Goebbels was certainly dead. But what about the other key players? What about Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe? Not long before Germany's collapse, Hitler sentenced Göring to death for allegedly attempting to seize control of the state. Bormann had orders to execute him upon Berlin's fall, which was inevitable. Göring chose to surrender to the Americans rather than face the Soviets, and on May 6th, he was captured by the U.S. Army's 36th Infantry Division. Göring's extravagant tastes for gold, jewels, and art were revealed during his trial, as well as his involvement in the Holocaust. Despite requesting death by firing squad, he was sentenced to death by hanging, and his life came to an abrupt end in his prison cell. If one were to list the top 5 Nazis, including Hitler, Bormann would likely rank 4th, with Goebbels in 3rd, Göring in 2nd, and Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and Gestapo, as the most prominent figure alongside Hitler. Himmler had incurred Hitler's wrath when he attempted to negotiate peace with the enemy. Hitler deemed this act treachery, the most disloyal act of Himmler's life, and ordered his capture and execution. On May 21st, after Hitler's ashes had been scattered, Himmler was apprehended by the British while attempting to escape. He was sent to the 31st Civilian Interrogation Camp outside the city of Lüneburg. Despite his civilian attire and the absence of his mustache, the British recognized the importance of their captive. However, as soon as Himmler admitted his identity, a doctor requested that he open his mouth wide. In the next moment, following a slight crunching sound, Himmler collapsed to the floor, dead. Hitler's inner circle was rapidly thinning. Another key figure, Reinhard Heydrich, had already been killed by Czech resistance fighters in 1942. This left another close associate, Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, who once harbored ambitions of becoming Hitler's successor. After Germany's surrender, the British arrested Speer. During the Nuremberg trials, it was revealed that Speer played a crucial role in the Nazi war machine, a literal architect of mass murder. However, the extent of his knowledge regarding the extermination plans remained uncertain, resulting in a 20-year prison sentence. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi Minister of Foreign Affairs, was also arrested in May 1945. Following the trials, he, too, received a death sentence. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, was next to face the gallows. Hitler's inner circle was now nearly empty. Another figure, Erich Ritter, the Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine, had lost his position due to the embarrassing defeat in the Battle of the Barents Sea off the coast of Norway. Despite not being executed, Ritter faced multiple charges, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. Donitz, who succeeded Ritter, received a 10-year prison sentence after some charges did not stick. Both men successfully argued that they were not directly involved in the Holocaust. The Nazis accused of significant involvement in the final solution were not as fortunate, unable to serve prison sentences, write books, or pursue gardening in later life. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, ensuring that he would not escape with just a prison term. Frank showed no remorse during his trial, stating, "I was happy when Adolf Hitler, in a most wonderful rise to power, unparalleled in the history of mankind, succeeded by the end of 1938. When asked if he participated in the annihilation of Jews, he answered affirmatively, shifting some responsibility to the higher-ranking Nazis. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, another architect of the Holocaust, is known as the monster of the Holocaust. His trial implicated Eichmann, making him a highly sought-after fugitive. Eichmann, a key figure in the Holocaust, helped transport millions of Jews to the camps where they would suffer and face extermination. He played a role in designing the plans for the final solution and issued orders to many who later denied their involvement. One of these individuals was Rudolf Höss, the Auschwitz commandant responsible for introducing Zyklon B gas for mass killings. Höss openly admitted to these actions, revealing that Auschwitz alone executed around 2.5 million people. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, as well as the others, attempted to downplay their involvement and shift blame onto others, but their denials were futile. These 10 men were considered the elite, but the mass extermination of millions required the involvement of thousands of individuals. The U.S. alone apprehended approximately 100,000 Germans accused of war crimes. The doctor's trial in 1946 saw 23 men accused of conducting or participating in horrific Nazi medical experiments. 7 were acquitted, 7 were sentenced to death, and the remaining defendants served around 10 years in prison. Over 1,300 witnesses testified about the atrocities committed in the concentration camps, leading to the presentation of over 30,000 documents and 132,000 pages of transcripts. Adolf Eichmann's involvement in the Holocaust was widely discussed during the trials. He became one of the most wanted men in the world. Another significant figure was Rudolf Höss, the Auschwitz commandant responsible for introducing Zyklon B gas as a method of extermination. Höss's testimony shocked everyone, shedding light on Eichmann's prominent role. Eichmann had gone into hiding, aided by others. In his written statement, Höss confirmed that they executed around 400,000 Hungarian Jews in Auschwitz during the summer of 1944, along with thousands of other victims. One of the most remarkable statements in Höss's testimony was regarding the use of Zyklon B gas. "We executed about 400,000 Hungarian Jews alone at Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. We knew when the people were dead because their screaming stopped. We usually waited about 1/2 hour before we opened the doors and removed the bodies. After the bodies were removed, our special commandos took off the rings and extracted the gold from the teeth of the corpses." Höss explained how mothers would hide their children in the camp, how he and his men tried to keep the extermination secret from the rest of the prisoners, but the foul and nauseating stench gave it away. In relation to the mass executions, he was asked again, "This entire action came to you directly from Himmler through Eichmann, who had been personally delegated?" He replied, "Yes." So, the line of command went Hitler, Himmler, Eichmann. As you know, Himmler was dead by this point, as was Hitler, so now Eichmann was the man that everyone wanted, that the Jewish people were screaming out for. But Eichmann was nowhere to be found. After the war, he was arrested with other SS officers by U.S. troops and later sent to a work camp. He'd given the U.S. authorities the name Otto Eggman. By the time Haas was spilling the beans, Eggman had escaped the camp and was hiding out in Germany under the name Otto Henninger. For these escaped Nazis to survive on the run, they needed a lot of friends. One of them was the Austrian bishop, Alois Hudel, a man who, years later, would refuse to admit he'd done anything wrong, famously saying, "We do not believe in the eye for an eye of the Jew." It was Hudel who made it possible for Eggman and many other war criminals to hide out in monasteries and Nazi-safe houses until they had sufficient paperwork to get a passport and head to Argentina or another far-flung nation. These escape routes were called ratlins. Many of them led to countries in South America, but other chosen destinations were Mexico, Switzerland, and, as you'll hear about in detail, the USA. There are various reasons why the Nazis chose South American countries. One is they could find other Germans there. Many of the countries were sympathetic to the Nazi cause. Cruel dictators would take them. There was also the fact that those countries didn't have extradition treaties, and once enough Nazis were in a certain country, they could form networks. A Nazi journalist interviewed Eggman in 1956. These recordings were not made public until 2022. They tell you a lot about Eggman, who quite nonchalantly admitted, "I didn't care about the Jews deported to Auschwitz, whether they lived or died. It was the Führer's order. Jews who were fit to work would work, and those who weren't would be sent to the final solution." As he said those sobering words, Jewish Nazi hunters were sure Eggman was somewhere in Argentina. Eggman had actually settled in well, working various jobs and, at one point, becoming the department head at a Mercedes-Benz plant in Buenos Aires under the name Clement. Little did the Nazi hunters know that the CIA knew that already. The CIA even had its own Nazis in South America on its payroll. Many years later, the agency declassified 27,000 documents about former Nazis and their lives on the run. One of the documents reads that Eggman is reported to have lived in Argentina under the alias Clemens. He was actually living under the name of Ricardo Clement. Why no one told the Nazi hunters this is complicated? It's believed the West Germans and the British also knew much that those Nazi hunters wanted to know. This was the Cold War, and perhaps those countries, like the US, had a reason not to share all their intelligence. You'll understand this more clearly soon. For now, we'll just say some men were supposed to stay hidden. In May 1960, a group of Israeli Mossad agents sent to capture Eggman staked out his house in San Fernando, a suburb of Buenos Aires. They watched him travel to work and back by bus. They were sure they had the right man. At one point, one of the agents went up to Eggman and talked to him in Spanish. Eggman got scared. He guessed what was happening, but before he could run, two other agents were wrestling him to the ground. One of the worst runaway monsters of World War II had been captured. This wasn't extradition in any sense of the law. It was kidnapping, but hey, what were they to do without any extradition treaties in place? The agents drugged Eggman and smuggled him back to Israel on a plane, breaking God knows how many laws on the way. This was incredibly controversial at the time. For an architect of the Nazi genocide, Israel basically said something like extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures. Eggman was soon standing in a courtroom, described by one of the 500 journalists as a thin, balding man of 55 who looked more like a bank clerk than a butcher. It was a naive thing to say. Evil doesn't snarl and have horns, it winks and wears a tie. Like the rest, Eggman denied being the monster he'd been made out to be. He told the court he didn't kill anyone and that he was only dealing with train timetables and technical aspects of evacuation transports. Nah, that didn't impress anyone. He was executed in 1962. When those Mossad agents were in Argentina, they had to make a sacrifice. That's because they might also have been able to capture the man that was known as the Angel of Death, the Nazi doctor that experimented on prisoners in the worst possible ways, Joseph Mengele. This is the man that would walk up to Jews after they entered the camp and picked out the specimens he wanted, often the children who would later call him uncle after he handed them candies. Little did they know they were going to be his human guinea pigs. This is how one of those kids later described being picked by Mengele. Dr. Mengele pulled me out of a queue as we were on the way from the sea lager camp to the gas chamber. I was the only one picked that day personally by Mengele and his assistant. They took me to his laboratory, where I met other children. They were screaming from pain. I was injected with drugs and chemicals. On the behalf of German pharmaceutical companies and the war effort in general, Mengele would purposefully infect people with diseases. He gave some gangrene after rubbing dirt and glass in wounds he'd made. He operated on people without anesthesia. Sometimes when he was done, he ordered them out of the back of the lab, where they were shot. It's not certain how many people were victims of these terrible experiments, but it was likely in the region of 27,000. It's been reported that over 4,300 of them died, and many more were rendered disabled or left with terrible scars. Lots of them later testified about the horrors they'd faced in the camp. His infinitely unethical work, of course, was useful to the Nazis. In a sane world, you can't experiment on humans, but in the world of war, the Nazi war, that suddenly became possible. Some were left outside to freeze to the point of death and were then dangerously heated up. Women had their muscles and nerves removed. Many had entire limbs hacked off. Some were given deadly blood infections. Dr. Zdenka Nedvedovna, a Czech doctor who worked alongside Mengele, later testified high amputations were performed. For example, even whole arms with shoulder blades or legs were amputated. These operations were performed mostly on insane women who were immediately killed after the operation by a quick injection. It wasn't an easy decision for those Mossad agents to know they were giving up Mengele in order to catch Eichmann. They'd heard the nightmarish stories, but in that contaminated sea of hidden Nazis, Eichmann was the bigger fish. One of the Mossad agents explained it simply: when I have a bird in my hand, I don't start looking for the bird in the bush. I'll take the bird in my hand, put it in a cage, and then deal with the one in the bush. But by the time the Red Army liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, Mengele was long gone. When the Americans got him in June, he'd already given all his important documents to a nurse. The U.S. had no idea who they had on their hands, so they released him under the name Fritz Ullmann, which he later changed to Fritz Ullmann. He stayed in Germany for a while working on farms, but when those testimonies revealed his sadistic experiments, he managed to persuade enough people he was a worthy candidate for a first-class Rattling ticket. SS members helped him get to Italy, where he got a passport from the International Committee of the Red Cross. In 1949, he sailed on a ship to Buenos Aires and later worked as a carpenter under the name of Helmut Greger. He was being careful for a good reason. A sure death sentence awaited him in Europe, but his confidence grew over the years. He made trips back to Europe to see his family, even going on a skiing holiday. Back in Argentina, he started a pharmaceutical company. He gave young women illegal abortions. He never really changed. Speaking about Brazil, he once wrote in his diary, "Brazil is a nice country to live in despite the mixing of the races. But there are many people who, like me, believe and are sympathetic to the Nazi movement and racial ideology." He remained a fan of eugenics, writing in another entry, "Weaker humans should not be permitted to reproduce. This is the only way for humankind to exist and sustain itself." During the trial of Eichmann in 1961, Mengele's name was mentioned numerous times. Later, in 1963, during the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, a witness named Vera Alexander shocked everyone in attendance when she said, "There was a set of twins, gypsies, whom he took away one day from the block where I was, that was the Zajunalagers, the gypsy camp. Some days later, he returned them, with veins in their arms and their backs sewn together. The judge couldn't believe his ears and asked her again, "He sewed them together? Like Siamese twins?" She replied, "Yes, he did." Alas, Mr. Mengele was never brought to justice. On February 7, 1979, while Mengele was at a coastal resort in Brazil, he had a stroke in a swimming pool and drowned. He was seen as one of the ones that got away, but little did Americans know that fiends like him were living among them at this time. None of this would have been possible if it wasn't for those ratlins. Franz Stengel is more proof. He was one of the worst. The commander of the Sobibor and Treblinka extermination camps. It said on his hands was the blood of possibly 1 million Jews. This made him an even bigger fish than Mengele. In 1948, he went to see that man of the cloth, Bishop Alois Hudel, when Hudel said to him, "You must be Franz Stengel, I've been expecting you." He first went to Syria with the documents Hudel gave him, and later, he headed to Brazil. With his family in tow, he worked in Sao Paulo at a Volkswagen car plant. But for once, justice was served, and Stengel was extradited. He was back in West Germany in 1967 and was sentenced to life in prison in 1970. Just 6 months into his sentence, he died from heart failure. He called the Jews he killed mere numbers, cargo, as he said one time. About mass murder, he stated, "That was my profession. I enjoyed it. It fulfilled me. And yes, I was ambitious about that, I won't deny it." In one of his last interviews, he told a journalist, "In reality, I share the guilt." 19 hours later, he was dead. Stengel, like many of the rats and the ratlins, crossed the Alps into Italy. They often hid out at the Capuchin monastery near Bressanone and sometimes the Franciscan monastery near Bolzano. This was called the monastery route. From there, Rome was usually the next destination, and then on to far-off places. In Rome, with a member of the Catholic Church having confirmed their identity, the International Committee of the Red Cross supplied them with a passport. Somewhere in the region of 120,000 papers were handed out leading up to 1951. This might sound strange, but it was due to humanitarian concerns. The so-called protective passports were for anyone at risk of persecution, including Jews during the Holocaust. Still, the organization was roundly criticized for giving those Nazis papers. "This was no time for neutrality," was the usual refrain. Sometimes those involved in the ratlins weren't neutral in the slightest, such as the U.S. intelligence agencies that helped the so-called Butcher of Lion escape. He was Klaus Barbie, a man whose face stayed in his victims' memories for the rest of their lives. The eyes, they used to say, they could never forget his evil eyes. Like a James Bond villain, he interrogated people suspected of being part of the French resistance with a cat in his arms. Survivors testified that he'd put the cat down and walk over to his toolbox, telling them, "You will speak to me. Trust me, you will talk." They all do in the end. One of them later testified, Barbie took pleasure, a pleasure that was astounding, in torturing. Another said, he had the eyes of a monster. He was savage. My God, he was savage. It was unimaginable. He butchered them in ways we can't even truly describe, and then sent them to their deaths at the camps. Barbie was the head of the Gestapo in Lyon, whose headquarters were at the famed El Hotel Terminus. This is where all the torture happened, often for days on end, with that damn cat of his always nearby. Not many people could hold out. Some did, though, such as a woman named Lise Lesevre, whom Barbie thought was connected to a resistance fighter named Didier. On his last attempt to torture her, after already smashing her up and freezing her in baths of ice cubes, he said in a calm voice, "I admire you, but in the end, everybody talks. What you have done is magnificent, my dear. Nobody has held out as long as you. It's nearly over now. I'm very upset. But let's finish. Go on, a little effort. Who is Didier? She said nothing, just looked at him from her swollen eyes with a hatred she never thought she could muster. He then said, "Liquidate her. I don't want to see her anymore." Stories like these were common. It was discovered after the war that Barbie sent possibly 4,000 of those people to the extermination camps, including dozens of orphans. This was a man with plenty of information about spies. He had a lot of intelligence in his mind and in his little black books, so after the war, he was a man of great value, a top asset. The British got there first. Their agents beat him and interrogated him, asking him everything he knew, including the names of all the secret communists in Europe. God only knows, the U.S. wanted these names more than anyone. In fact, the U.S. took Barbie away from the Brits. A paper written on the matter reads, CIC rationalized that if unemployed, Barbie would renew his overtures to the British, who would find out that CIC had not turned him in. The U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, an early iteration of the CIA, knew the French wanted Barbie the Butcher to pay for his crimes, but he was just too good to give up. So, the CIC put Barbie on the payroll. They said if he spied for them as an anti-communist, he'd live very comfortably and get hundreds of dollars for his work. Well, thought Barbie, that sounds better than hanging from a rope. They also promised him they'd make his name disappear, since the word was already getting around about this the Butcher of Lion. It wasn't an easy decision for the CIC. They knew the French wanted justice. It was a matter of thinking about what was better in the greater scheme of things, and the agency chose to keep Barbie. Now things get really crazy. A now declassified file states, in 1951, the CIC sponsored his escape to South America via Ratland operating through Italy. The question is, who did they pay? In actions that many years later the U.S. Justice Department would have to issue apologies over, the CIC enlisted a fascist war criminal who was one of the main instruments of Ratland escapes. He was the Croatian priest named Dr. Krunoslav Draganovic, a nasty piece of work said to be behind the murder of hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Serbs and Jews. Here is part of a secret CIC memo that was decades later unearthed. The 430th CIC detachment has been operating what they term a Ratland evacuation system to Central and South America without serious repercussions during the past 3 years. At the cost of approximately $1,000 for each adult, 430th CIC is transferring evacuees to Italy, where they are provided with legal documentation obtained through devious means there. South American dictators ran a tight ship in terms of capturing and killing their enemies, and Barbie was the king of interrogations. They tortured their critics and made others go missing. Since they were anti-communist, they got the backing of the U.S. under Operation Condor. The U.S. paid for and arranged coups of democratically elected leaders, so relatively speaking, having a Nazi on the payroll wasn't such a big deal. There is even some circumstantial evidence that it was Barbie and the CIA working in a collaboration that led to Guevara's capture by Bolivian soldiers. We now know that Barbie was also on the payroll of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. He was Agent 43,118. Like the U.S., West Germany would rather this not have come out, but it did. Barbie worked with other organizations that killed indiscriminately and ruled by fear, the drug traffickers. For a while, he helped Bolivia's biggest drug lord, Roberto Suarez Gomez, aka the King of Cocaine. He later got pally with Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel. Escobar gave him money for his anti-communist work, which was kind of weird given the U.S. was after Escobar yet at the same time working with Barbie. It wasn't too long, though, before his identity was revealed, and he was on his way back to Europe to face the music. The spying agencies of Americans, the Brits, and the West Germans were all somewhat hot under the collar because they'd known all along he was alive and well, working as torturer-in-chief in South America while trafficking drugs. When he arrived at the airport in 1983, a 44-year-old woman who he had tortured as a kid was there and tried to shoot him. She failed and got arrested herself. He was hated that much, so his appearance was mightily embarrassing for the Americans. The Justice Department had to make that apology. Its long investigation led to a paper being written, with sections headed with things like the Army's interest in reactivating Barbie in 1965 to 1967, drug trafficking, weapons trade, and Barbie's entries to the United States. While Nazis hunters struggled to find him and the French were clueless about his whereabouts, the CIA was writing memos that said he could be re-recruited in the late 60s if he could provide unique information of significant importance under secure operational conditions. Barbie went to trial. His victims hissed and screamed at him in the courtroom. Some broke down, describing in harrowing detail what had happened to them back in Lyon. Journalists were rendered speechless by what they heard, how this now old man had been the very embodiment of sadism. Barbie's lawyer tried to argue that what Barbie had done was no different from what the Americans did in My Lai in Vietnam and what the French did in Algeria. It didn't work. He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and died 4 years later in prison. The question now was, who else had the CIA and FBI known about all these years? Declassified documents tell us the FBI investigated the possibility of Hitler escaping through a ratline to South America. Some of the 700 FBI documents declassified in 2014 said just that, or at least wrote about the possibility of it happening. One of them states, Hitler reported to be hiding out in foothills of southern Andes. The file says a meeting took place in Hollywood. A man in that meeting said he was in a group of 4 people who met Hitler and his party when they landed from a submarine in Argentina. More subs arrived carrying around 50 people, including doctors, all part of Hitler's escape party. All kinds of things were coming out, but that didn't mean they were true. The CIA, under Operation Bloodstone, had tried after the war to hire leading former Nazis in hiding so as to recruit them into the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Both J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and Allen Dulles at the CIA were in on this. The New York Times said in a report that about 1,000 Nazi war criminals were hired, and some ended up being given the papers to move to the U.S. One case involved a man accused of machine gunning down 60,000 Jews in Lithuania. He was hired by the CIA as a spy and paid $1,700 a year, as well as 2 cartons of cigarettes for each month. That was in 1952. In 1956, he was given the green light to emigrate to the U.S. Years later, when the FBI wanted to prosecute him, the CIA stepped in and said they couldn't do that because it would expose them. In 1980, the FBI told the Justice Department to please step aside when the latter said, "We know at least 16 Nazi war criminals are living in the U.S. working for you." There were FBI informants, giving information to the agency on who in the U.S. had sympathies for the commies. 16 had been hired, but in 1980, only 6 were still on the payroll. The FBI sent a memo to its agents reminding them the most important thing was protecting the confidentiality of such sources of information to the fullest possible extent. One of these undercover agents was SS Officer Otto von Bolschwing. He'd worked under Eichmann and once authored a research paper on how best to terrorize Jewish people. Despite being a war criminal, he hooked up with the CIC after the war, and later when it became the CIA, Bolschwing was one of the agency's best European spies. The CIA thanked him in 1954 when it moved him and his family to New York, what the agency said was the reward for his loyal post-war service. Another note admitted that if the Israelis find out and he's exposed as one of Eichmann's main men, it will be embarrassing to the U.S. The CIA managed to keep the information about his close relationship with Eichmann under wraps for at least a while. They weren't all great spies. The Times wrote, but many Nazi spies proved inept or worse, declassified security reviews show. Some were deemed habitual liars, confidence men, or embezzlers, and a few even turned out to be Soviet double agents. Who knows, maybe that quiet man next door your grandmother used to talk about was a Nazi war criminal helped through a U.S.-sponsored ratline.